Hello, hello! Така. В играта вече почна да загрубяваме. What the fuck? Какво става с нас? Да!
Order failed.
Какъв order failed, братче? На някой акаунт съм влезнал някакси.
Order failed.
Къде с какво съм влезнал, бе? Важното е да не съм на пасниците акаунт, само искам да проверя. Добре. Добре, всички паснати акаунти са сейф. Тогава на какво съм влязал? На нито един акаунт не ми излиза да съм влезал на каквото и да е. Сякаш. Имам някакъв акаунт. Фак. Добре, екзит.
Order failed.
Добре, затворих $388 профит на NASDAQ. What the fuck? Явно на някой акаунт съм се забравил нещо и... Добре, доволен съм. $388 профит, супер. Даже не разбрах какво съм направил. Окей. Michael's what? What the fuck? What the fuck? Само спомня, че може би GVP-то ме е вкарала нещо. Не, добре. Не съм влезъл на GVP-то. Че тук с личния акаунт бях сложил някакъв лимит горе. Само секунда да съм сигурен, че всичко е наред навсякъде, защото на личния акаунт бях сложил един limit order на GBP и ние се доближаваме много стремглаво до този limit order, goddammit. Какво става, бе, братче? Какво се случва тук? What the fuck, какъв е то кендъл на златото? What the fuck? Не съм влезнал. В принцип не исках да влизам никъде. Ама явно някъде съм влезнал. Сложил съм някакъв лимит ордер. What the fuck? Това злато. Трябваше да сложа лимит ордер на златото за лонг от някъде отдолу. Не, това е просто брутално. Сигурен съм, че това е заради купувачи и продавачи и нищо не се манипулира, нали така? Няма манипулация, няма лъжа, няма измама. Добре, сега да видим само. Имаме брутално SMT на еврото и паунда. То аз тук трябва да гледам месечна графика, не дневна, защото това е брутално. Добре, може би паунда ще... Какво се случва, човек? Добре, може би ако гледам месечната графика, еврото трябва да си обере този хай. и да паунда да го остави и може да влезне на някакъв шорт, свинг шорт, нещо такова. Ще видим. Не, това, в смисъл, това няма трейдване, в смисъл в момента просто това няма трейдване. И как ме я, че се затворих лонговете на NASDAQ толкова рано, тъй като бях влезнал на лонг, ето тук, доста ниско долу, но викам, айде ще затворя, за да няма, да не съм такъв хазартаджия. Златото, брутален 5-минутен кендъл. Много добре. Я видим какво говори то пич като цяло. Той още нищо не е казал. Всъщност чакай, че аз съм направил на гледance. И забравих. Ме е интересно Патрик дали казва нещо.
Yeah, the 2% drop, and we're gonna leave in the markets, and he won't leave. What happened to him? He left clearly. All right, the high of day is at 550 area.
Добре, не мога да гледам Патрик. По-скоро ще спусна FOMC новините. Да видим какво случва с долара. На долара му слагам един лимит, защото мисля, че така не е лимит, аларма, защото мисля, че ще оберем този долу на долара. И ако оберем този долу на долара, но искам да спусна FOMC Live. FOMC Live. Така.
In the Federal Reserve's projection, because as Mike McKee just indicated, the dispersion, which is something you talked about, the spread of the dots for next year is incredibly wide.
And it makes one wonder if a certain dot has a greater weight than other dots, given the fact that the market is moving on the idea of more cuts, even though some of the other dots suggested only 2 cuts this year and relatively few next year. And the Statement of Economic Projections talks about a Fed funds rate that ends next year well above 3%. We are now below that in the futures market.
Some of you are interesting. You got a median, you got a central tendency, you got a home in the range and all that. Guess what? There's not a median statistic here above 2%. Is sub 2% economic growth politically acceptable coming up on an election in 2026? I don't think so.
The answer to that is no.
No,
which is why
this is edge of Europe is what I'm looking at
to
here.
your point, TK, which is why this administration would like this Federal Reserve to be a lot more aggressive than these dots would imply.
Which is the reason why the market is hearing exactly what you're pointing out, that is not an acceptable kind of reality. And that's why I think it'll be very interesting to see how Fed Chair Powell really gets behind this.
Greg Peters, you're following the story as it evolves. What's your initial takeaway?
Yeah, so the initial.
Добре, вие какво мислите, че ще се случи с пазара днес?
I am surprised by only one dissent, though. I think most people thought, myself included, you'd have 3. But I think the question that we're looking at is inflation itself. So it's embedded in that forecast. Is it still I'm sorry to say, transitory inflation component driven by tariffs?
Добре, мисля, че долара си обрала, добре.
If indeed that is factoring in.
Вау, паунда доста доближава до лимит ордър ми, мамка, аз мисля го пренесте направо.
There's more for cuts because they're not as worried about that. So I would just need to look at the inflation number in abstract. I think what's driving it underneath is the key.
To your point, there is a very clean, dare I say, convenient glide path back down to 2% in a forecast from 3.1 for this year, 2.6 for the next, 2.1 after that, and 2 for core PCE.
Yeah, there's a big rebuttal on that, and that is in the dollar. And you mentioned it earlier.
Да, фъкит, не сте го за сега лимит ордър на паунда, защото то ще го удари всеки момент.
Across the board in everything but the dollar, which just hit the lowest levels going back for the entirety of this year. That is speaking volumes about exactly what you just pointed to.
We just took out 190 on the euro dollar. That's how it was here. and catch up with Bob Michael at JP Morgan in the heart of foreign exchange in the city of London. Bob,
Златото
we've got about 8 minutes to go over this one. What jumps out to you, sir?
направи бахти отбирането на ликвидност. 8,5 до 3,8. В смисъл. Добре, еврото си обра този хай. Така че имаме бериш SMT тук с този хай и тук.
Surprisingly restricted to them. They were probably we've kept policy a lot more restricted than we thought. Let's start getting to neutral and let's do it in unified fashion. I think this is good for the markets.
Bob, good for the markets. Let's talk about which ones. It might be
Вау, колко перфектна реакция от имбаланса на Нью Йорк. Точно тук. What the fuck? Вау! Това, ако бях видял една идея по-рано, нямаше да е зле.
It was just a suggestion to us not to expect 50 basis point rate cuts in here, but 25 perhaps every meeting for the next few meetings. 3% right away, they pause somewhere around 3.5 either side of that. I get that. I'm sort of with the Fed. We don't really know the shape of inflation. Right now, the evidence is pretty good. Businesses have absorbed some of it, and the consumer hasn't really pushed back all that much. And there's been signs of disinflation. So I'm not that concerned about inflation.
But your colleague Michael Ferrell in the global headlines a long time ago.
Брутално SMT между другото имаме между
Potential GDP.
S&P и NASDAQ.
COVID, tri-stimulus, and all the rest and the legislation. These growth estimates today, do we have to get used to this sub 2% real GDP?
Брутално SMT.
It doesn't feel like we're going to have to get used to it. It feels like we live in a changes on the accommodative side, both fiscal and monetary. We're looking at dots now, but we also haven't weighed in. Forget about tariffs. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, that starts to hit in earnest in the first quarter. So I wouldn't be surprised to see GDP estimates get finished.
For those of you just tuning in about 10 minutes.
Да, бе, какво става с криптото? Я погледнем всъщност.
To cut interest rates by 25 basis points. There was one dissent, an individual looking for a 50 basis point cut. That was the newly minted Governor Myron sent over from the White House. Federal Reserve. You want to get to something, CK? Check this out.
Всъщност, нищо интересно все още.
Go to the dot plot and you look at 2025. There is a very lonely dot at the very bottom of the screen, and it's sub 3%. Not for next year, but for this year. There is a dot there, just below 3% for 2025. Now, we were all asking, of course, when you follow those things, there are no names on the dots. You don't know who they belong to, but I think we've got a pretty good idea who this might have come from. We've been asking how aggressive government might be. The sentiments push for a whole lot more for the year ahead.
You mean 125 basis points of rate cuts by the end of this year seems a little bit aggressive? To me, it might be exceptional for people to hear that and absurd if you think about the growth in the
Здрасти.
And yet, how much is the market trading off this? And I wonder, how much does this have disproportionate weight in the market? Because this is someone who really is coming with the backing of the president and could be some sort of signification of who he might pick next year.
В принцип си мисля, че може да имаме шорт на еврото. За свинг, може би някакъв доста нисък риск, може би ако се влезе. Между другото съм направил доста голяма простотия на апексите и ако станат нещата ще ви кажа, но за сега няма да ви показвам какво се случва. Само ще чувате order field, order field, order field, order field. Това най-вероятно ще почне да го чуват след малко.
Will be this elasticity in terms of demand.
Red Peters is not clueless. I'm looking at the Bloomberg Total Return Corporate Index, and it is a miracle present. The Lehman Brothers, etc. Now the Bloomberg Total Return Index.
Zero interest rates, negative interest rates will continue to be looked back on as a bad idea. That drove those rates to those levels. So I
But
don't
can we
think
go on the edge of Myron? I guess that's the question. Can
Order
we-
filled.
I don't think you can get there without a recession, honestly. And
Ще
I think
започне да чувате Order Field
Order
доста,
Field.
доста често след малко.
right? So we're not even at the top of neutral yet.
Yeah.
So the Fed still has room. They still can get to 4% and you know they're neutral, right? And so we have a long way to go. Well, as you get much lower.
Взел съм си два непаснати акаунта на Apex за pure gambling, само
I think
казвам.
that's a different question. So I think we're all kind of shopping together by the smooth, but the truth of the matter is we're not in neutral territory yet.
In some ways, this was the
Order filled.
And every decision after
Order
becomes
filled.
harder. In equities right now this afternoon, equities rolling over on the S&P 500, so negative now by about 0.25%. Check out the Russell up by 1.24%. The rally for small caps continues. Bond yield still a little bit lower than
Или ще ги блоуват тези двата акаунта, или ще се паснат бързо.
Order filled.
down by almost 2 basis points. We've got Bob Marley, JP Morgan still with us. But I want to come back to you. You've just
Order
said the
filled.
Federal Reserve. And I don't know what we get in the news conference, but let's just go with what they've told us so far. They're telling us we can upgrade growth, not bring down the projections for inflation, and ultimately offer you more rate cuts. How bullish does that make you as a bond investor?
Aren't they magical? That's all dependent on their policy. If they
Очаквам да направим, ние го направихме SMT, bullish SMT
they are
тук.
going to cause greater growth and
Okay.
and stable inflation.
Okay.
Look, I think there are so many policies in flux on the fiscal side that we don't know.
Затварям
I think what
partial.
we do know
Order filled.
is that the liquidity is starting to shrug
Окей,
by a greater degree
600
than
profit
we
за сега.
all had thought, and we saw that revision of things. And it's time to start relieving some of the pressure on corporate America now.
John, it's 216. We've yet to mention tariffs. I find that extraordinary.
So I'm pleased you brought this up too, Kate, because I think still a lot of people are talking about the tariffs of April as an event and not a process. And I think it's far more important to be open-minded about the process and the potential of pass-through still to come. We know based on the data so far that we aren't seeing the exporters drop prices aggressively. You can see that in import prices. We know based on the data so far that a lot of companies domestically are absorbing this on margin.
Right.
What we don't know is whether they pass on those costs in the next several months and change this inflation picture.
Exactly. And when I look at the Excel spreadsheet from the Fed, even the sub 2% growth, my question is, are you seeing a decline in purchasing power? And that's why you see, the curve coming down and yields coming down right now.
I think what we've seen, Tom, without a doubt, is that we've seen a massive step down in payroll growth.
Order filled.
Some members of this Federal
май ми
Reserve.
затвори някакъв
But Lisa, I think
partial.
it's key to point
О,
out,
да.
not all members of this Federal Reserve.
Айде ще ви покажа какво съм направил,
Order filled.
но това не го препоръчва на никой.
Which has been pretty stable.
Order filled.
Oh, brutal.
Forecast from the Fed. They're still forecasting pretty stable unemployment around 4.5%.
Yeah, which is
Бях сложил лимит ордери тук за buy, като направим ей това bullish SMT. А то развлекме всъщност bullish SMT.
Right now, is this a trial balloon for what it would be if there was a Fed that was being more aggressive? Or
Добре.
not there yet. And then I think it's going to be a tell in terms of does the public behave if it believes that a Fed is willing to really prioritize growth in a significant way over inflation.
Hey, Bob, good to catch up as always. Michael there of JP Morgan. Lisa, let's turn to Dan Swong of KPMG. She's standing by. Dan, welcome to the program. So much to process here going into this news conference in about 12 minutes' time. What's your number one issue going into the presser?
Well, first of all, it's really clear that Powell corralled the cats, and I assume
Stop filled.
9% in part because of the strong retail sales data, which also revealed inequality.
$1 profit.
There, and that is that
Oh, what the
spending
fuck?
on
No way the ball.
went up after adjusting for inflation. Spending at grocery stores actually fell after adjusting for inflation and the retail sales numbers. And so you've got this sort of, the K-shaped economy we keep talking about, the bifurcation.
Но ако бях това да го
But now
направя злато,
we're
ще е
now
доста
seeing
по-добре, честно
underlying
казвам.
weakness in lower and middle income households. So this was clearly an acknowledgement that yes, the labor market has weakened and they want to shore up the labor market. What surprised me as well was that we had heard the Fed talk about a reduction in what they thought the neutral rate was. Powell had referred to that there had been some discussion about that in previous meetings. That did not show up in the forecast. And I think that's important as well because they're removing restriction now. It's not just calibrating down because the neutral rate has moved down. They're trying to say, listen, we're removing some restriction, acknowledging the weakness in the labor market, want to shore up the labor market. But if you really do read this sort of through to next year with a major change in leadership at the Fed, you could have a situation where you overstimulate and get in more pernicious and self-fulfilling prophecy on the fact that consumers and firms now expect inflation to be higher. And I think what the Fed is struggling with is that consumers are also telling them in their own surveys that the job market is the worst it's been on record since 2013. That's something that has got to have startled the Fed as well.
Diane, this is without a doubt a very confusing economic time. It's also a very confusing time when it comes to the Fed's reaction function. Do you have a clear sense of how the Fed is going to prioritize incoming data, whether it's retail sales or jobless claims, or whether it's the payrolls report, and decide how much to ease?
It's really hard. This is, it's one thing for the Fed to have forecast the stagflationary mild bout of stagflation that they did since March, that's gotten more stagflationary over time. That was hard to forecast. It's another thing to live it in real time. And that's what we're doing. And unfortunately, it is very hard to you have to shore up the labor market a bit. That said, you don't want to remove accommodation that you allow. We heard earlier, the idea that these are an uneven rollout of tariffs. So it's not just one and done. And Powell was careful in his Jackson Hole remarks on that too. It's not all at once. It's coming in waves. That reinforces the idea that we're going to its own self-fulfilling prophecy. Has to be
Сега в момента покрай тези новини е достатъчно казино.
The mail I get is people are flat on their back in this K-shaped economy. How does Jerome Powell address the have-nots of America? They don't have AI. They didn't buy NVIDIA like John 3 years ago. What do we do with the people that aren't participating in the system?
Добре, май.
It's really the inequality is getting worse. We know that. Actually, Moody's just came out with an updated estimate on some inequality.
Не ми се рискува да шопвам личния акаунт еврото и паунда, честно казвам. Макар че си мисля, че ще дропне. Направихме SMT на monthly база. Ама малко не ми се рискува.
Relative to inflation, the rest of the economy is 80%, pretty much flatlining since after adjusting for inflation on their spending patterns. That's a really tough position to be in, and it gets to the hard the embers of the pandemic inflation were still smoldering when you added on the tariff-induced increases in prices. And that's what's really tough for the Fed to deal with and for the average American, because remember, even when the labor market was much more robust, when inflation flared, the majority of Americans believed we were in a recession because their purchasing power was eroding and they were losing ground. And I think
that's
really gets the explosive nature of inflation. And at the end of the day, you cannot sustain unless you really derail inflation. What we don't know is if this will just be a couple steps up and then just come off, or if it will be more persistent, and that's what
Okay, вече съм out от всички позиции.
That they're going to be mindful to watch what's coming on in terms of how persistent the inflation becomes and how much
И ще видим дали Nasdaq ще дропне още.
To get Germany unmoored.
NVIDIA, that's my biggest position, TK. Hindsight.
But you killed it.
I wish.
You just killed it.
Dan Swank of KPMG. Dan, thank you. Appreciate it. Matt Lazzetti of Deutsche Bank standing by. Matt, welcome to the program. What an interesting forecast mix. more rate cuts in our future, growth apparently
Много ме
okay.
изкушава, но вече доста дропна.
Explain that one, Matt.
Yes, I think for the near term, it's pretty clear. They talked about increased
Ще
downside risk
изчакаме
in the labor
евентуално
market.
още
And so this
пуш и
is
това
all
ще
about
видим.
risk management. It's not about modal forecasts at all. As you noted, growth is stronger, the unemployment rate unchanged for this year, inflation unchanged for this year. You can see that at the back of the SCP, their forecast, there was a little bit of a shift in the distribution of risks.
Не мисля,
Those
че ще
officials that are
направим
more worried
бахти
about downside
дропа.
risk to the labor market, less officials that are more worried about upside risk to inflation. It's basically in line with what we're anticipating. The Fed shifting in a little bit more dovish direction today, close call on the 2 versus 3 dots. I think the key question for Chair Powell is how much does he lean into the near-term signal of cutting at each meeting this year?
Do you get a sense, Matt, of how much the reaction function has shifted? John's done a really great job of talking about how from July to August, there seemed to be a shift from the unemployment rates, the headlines, payrolls report. Do you have a sense of just how tolerant this Fed is going to be of inflation well above 2% for years on end and keep cutting?
Look, I think they're showing us that they're pretty tolerant about target inflation. In fact, if you look at their forecast for next year, they actually raised their inflation forecast by 0.2. They raised their growth forecast. They lowered their unemployment rate forecast, and yet we see a lower Fed funds rate. I think the reality is we are now projecting at 5+ years of inflation being at least 50 basis points above their target, and yet they are cutting rates into that environment. So I think it's a Fed where, as long as there are no worries about the labor market, they can be hyper-focused on inflation. But once some of those concerns of the labor market really manifest, you see a pretty dovish shift. And I think that's what we saw from Chair Powell at Jackson Hole, and we're seeing it manifested now through the dot plot.
Matt was Diane Swank brought it up, and many others have as well. We're all focused on tariffs and substitution. Are we seeing a decline in purchasing power here? Is there an income effect from tariffs that the Fed has to fill in? And what is this, John? 15 more beeps they're going to do by the end of the year?
Potentially, yeah. Widespread of estimates, though, TK.
Все още е брутално белиш есенти новини.
Matt, purchasing rate, this is a huge issue for Americans, isn't it?
It is, no doubt. But I think the main area where you would first see that is through consumer spending data. And I take Diane's point and the points earlier that there's great dispersion around that data, with that being driven by higher income households. At the same time, GDP growth is tracking above 3% in Q3. It was above 3% in Q2. Retail sales are...
В крайна сметка май трябваше да вляза на това. Ако не бях преместил лимит ордера на GDP, щеше да го чукне на туда тип. Ама се понасрах.
Monetary policy has one blunt tool, which is the Fed funds rate. So really, they're not apt or really able to get at a lot of those distributional issues. I think Chair Powell and the Fed would probably tell you that is more up to tax and spending policies that we would see from the administration. So I don't think that this is really about trying to alleviate some of those distributional concerns. I think it's concerns about the aggregate labor market.
Павел трябва да говори. Има пресконференция в 9:30.
Malazadi, appreciate it. One of the best, Matt. Thank you, sir. Malazadi there of Deutsche Bank. The news conference a few minutes away. We often hear people come on the program and say, I expect it to be dovish, and really the response to that should always be dovish.
Стан, коя сесия трейдваш по принцип? Имаш ли си определено време, отделено за трейдинг в денощето или когато видиш възможности? Трейдвам, по принцип, трейдвам лондонската сесия от 10 до към 12, един нещо такова. И след това трейдвам Нью-Йоркска сесия след 4:30.
That's basically what the Fed thinks to be the case in this forecast today.
The currency markets are hearing that loud and clear. And I think that is the biggest tell. And I keep going back to that. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index now at a new post-2022 low. We have seen it completely weaken fall versus these counterparts because of this prioritization of growth over inflation by the FOMC and a reiteration of that in this SEP.
Rick, I got to ask you a basic question. You've been doing this for a few years. When you read sell-side literature right now, economic think tank literature, can you express the difference?
Yes, I think forecasts are always fraught. The dot plot is no different than a sell-side forecast. That it's not like they come with any additional information. But I think it is particularly there's so much going on, and I hate the word uncertainty, but it is the right word. I mean, we've been talking about tariffs as an example. We have a Supreme Court decision coming. We don't know just as one example. So it's a really difficult environment. So you should expect to see more dispersion. What the markets are trying to suss out, what I'm trying to suss out is what's real and what's political. And I think that's an open question, and time will tell on that front.
Is the political real?
Well, the political is driving the real.
They're going to be the same thing next year, aren't they?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this is the world, or this is the investment realm that we have to. So it's not going to change anytime soon. But this was an incredibly dovish set and dot plot.
Доста интересен кендъл на златото.
Responding in kind.
Well, we don't know for sure who that dot actually belongs to at the Federal Reserve. You can have a decent guess. Sure. They're not going to tell us, but here's my point.
I bet you $10.
It would be a mistake, I think, to say that's government money. Isn't that a hint, a flavor of what could be coming further down the line in 2026? Isn't that ultimately what the Fed share dot could look like in the next 12 months?
Why I do believe, based on the market activity, people are putting a disproportionate amount of weight in that dot. Because it is a flavor of who that manufacturer is. For example,
Because the markets will police the politicians in Washington.
TK, you say that. This was nice notice inflation forecast and just cut rates.
But we are, as he correctly said, Greg said.
Много жалко, че пасните акаунти и Лонга го затворих доста рано, защото все пак си е рисково да държиш по време на новини.
Led by the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, who stepped into the room. Let's take a listen to the chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Опа! Идва дъртя!
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I remain squarely focused on achieving
Айде,
the
почна.
goals of maximum employment and stable prices for the benefit of the American people. While the unemployment rate remains low, it has edged up. Job gains have slowed, and downside risks to employment have risen. At the same time, inflation has risen recently and remains somewhat elevated. In support of our goals, and in light of the shift in the balance of risks, today the Federal Open Market Committee decided to lower our policy interest rate by 0.25 percentage point. We also decided to continue to reduce our securities holdings. I'll have more to say about monetary policy after briefly reviewing economic developments. Recent indicators suggest that growth of economic activity has moderated. GDP rose at a pace of around 1.5% in the first half of the year, down from 2.5% last year. The moderation in growth largely reflects a slowdown in consumer spending. In contrast, business investment in equipment and intangibles has picked up from last year's pace. Activity in the housing sector remains weak. In our summary of economic projections, the median participant projects GDP to rise 1.6% this year and 1.8% next year, a touch stronger than projected in June. In the labor market, the unemployment rate edged up to 4.3% in August, but remains little changed over the past year at a relatively low level. Payroll job gains have slowed significantly to a pace of just 29,000 per month over the past 3 months. A good part of the slowing likely reflects a decline in the growth of the labor force due to lower immigration and lower labor force participation. Even so, labor demand has suffered, and the recent pace of job creation appears to be running below the break-even rate needed to hold the unemployment rate constant. In addition, wage growth has continued to moderate while still outpacing inflation. Overall, the market slowing in both the supply of and demand for workers is unusual. In this less dynamic and somewhat softer labor market, the downside risks to employment appear to have risen. In our SEP, the median projection for the unemployment rate is 4.5% at the end of this year and edges down thereafter. Inflation has eased significantly from its highs in mid-2022, but remains somewhat elevated relative to our 2% longer run goal. Estimates based on the Consumer Price Index and other data indicate that total PCE prices rose 2.7% over the 12 months ending August, and that, excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 2.9%. These readings are higher than earlier in the year as inflation for goods has picked up. In contrast, disinflation appears to be continuing for services. Near-term measures of inflation expectations have moved up on balance over the course of this year on news about tariffs, as reflected in both market and survey-based measures. Beyond the next year or so, however, most measures of longer-term expectations remain consistent with our 2% inflation goal. The median projection in the SEP for total PCE inflation is 3.0% this year and falls to 2.6% in 2026 and to 2.1% in 2027. Our monetary policy actions are guided by a dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. At today's meeting, the committee decided to lower the target range for the federal funds rate by a quarter percentage point.
Долара се обрава месечно на много.
4%.
Май трябваше да си махам лимита ордера на
GDP. Changes to
Ще
government policies
стане
continue to evolve and their
доста
effects
добър
on the
шорт
economy
маркет.
remain uncertain.
Но се понасрах, няма да
Have
има.
begun to push up prices in some categories of goods, but their overall effects on economic activity and inflation remain to be seen. A reasonable base case is that the effects on inflation will be relatively short-lived, a one-time shift in the price level. But it is also possible that the inflationary effects could instead be more persistent, and that is a risk to be assessed and managed. Our obligation is to ensure that a one-time increase in the price level does not become an ongoing inflation. In the near term, risks to inflation are tilted to the upside and risks to employment to the downside, a challenging situation. When our goals are in tension like this, our framework calls for us to balance both sides of our dual mandate. With downside risks to employment having increased, the balance of risks has shifted. Accordingly, we judged it appropriate at this meeting to take another step toward a more neutral policy stance. With today's decision, we remain well positioned to respond in a timely way to potential economic developments. We will continue to determine the appropriate stance of monetary policy based on the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. In our SEP, FOMC participants wrote down their individual assessments of an appropriate path for the federal funds rate, based on what each participant judges to be the most likely scenario for the economy. The median participant projects that the appropriate level of the federal funds rate will be 3.6% at the end of this year, 3.4% at the end of 2026, and 3.1% at the end of 2027. This path is 1/4 percentage point lower than projected in June. As is always the case, these individual forecasts are subject to uncertainty, and they're not a committee plan or decision. Policy is not on a preset course. The Fed has been assigned two goals for monetary policy: maximum employment and stable prices. We remain committed to supporting maximum employment, bringing inflation sustainably to our 2% goal, and keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Our success in delivering on these goals matters to all Americans. We understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission, and we at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Chris Regaver, Associated Press. As you know, Fed Governor Stephen Miron has kept his position at the White House, even as he's joined the Fed board. This is the first time, I believe, the Fed's board has had someone with executive branch ties in decades.
Мамкам от това GBP, защо се насрах? Да бях влязъл с 0,1 поне. Ау!
So we did welcome a new committee member today, as we always do. and the committee remains united in pursuing our dual mandate goals.
Why?
We're strongly committed to maintaining our independence, and beyond that, I really don't have anything to share.
Долара си обра месечния лоу. Еврото си обра месечния хай. Имаме есенти. Защо не влязло? Защо не влязло? Дори с 0,05. Това е бахта трейдър.
Do you see that as a possible outcome here? The tariffs are the reason we're seeing some slowing, particularly in the labor market, rather than in inflation?
Bull wrong.
We're beginning to see, we have begun to see goods prices showing through into higher inflation, and actually the increase in goods prices accounts for most of the increase in inflation, all of the increase in inflation over the course of this year. Those are not very large effects at this point. And we do expect them to continue to build over the course of the rest of the year and into next year. And it's also possible and that there may be effects on unemployment, but that I would say if you're looking at why employment is doing what it's doing, that's much more about the change in immigration. So the supply of workers has obviously come way down. There's very little growth, if any, in the supply of workers. And at the same time, demand for workers has also come down quite sharply. To the point where we see what I call a curious balance. Typically when we say things are in balance, that sounds good, but in this case, the balance is because both supply and demand have come down quite sharply. Now demand coming down a little more sharply because we now see the unemployment rate edging up.
Nick from Russell Wall Street Journal.
Добре, май ще сложа някакви лимити. Макар че имаме вече bullish S&P тук на малък time frame, ще сложа някакви лимити може би на 2,25.
What we can say is this, that over the course of this year, we've kept our policy at a restrictive level, and people have different views, but a clearly restrictive level, I would say. And we were able to do that over the course of this year because the labor market was in very solid condition with strong job creation and all those things.
Не знам защо гледам като не разбирам. То в момента е да разбираш и да разбираш в момента е много хард да трейдваш въобще. Така че присъедини се утре в 4 часа и тогава може да отговаряме на въпроси и така нататък.
Goals, and that suggests that we should be moving in the direction of neutral, and that's what we did today.
Under what circumstances would a larger than 25 basis points rate cut be warranted, and how seriously was that change that you're meeting this week?
There wasn't widespread support at all for a 50 basis point cut today. I think we've done
свалиха ги лихвите. Ама само с 0,25
rate cuts in the last 5 years, and you tend to do those at a time when you feel that policy is out of place and needs to move quickly to a new place. That's not at all what I feel certainly now. I feel like our policy has been doing the right thing so far this year. I think we were right to wait and see how tariffs and inflation and the labor market. I think we're now reacting to the much lower level of job creation and other evidence of softening in the labor market, and saying that those risks are maybe not fully balanced, but moving in the direction of balance now. And so that warrants a change in policy.
Colby Smith from the New York Times. Should we be viewing today's cut as the committee taking out some insurance against the possibility that the labor market is at risk of weakening? Or is it the committee's view that the dynamics of a downturn are already in place? I guess I'm just trying to square the shift in the rate forecast in the SEP towards more cuts.
Много се напрегнах с това GDP, човек.
The fact that the forecast for unemployment didn't change.
Yeah, I think you can think of this in a way as a risk management cut, because if you look at the SEP, actually, the projections for growth this year and next actually ticked up just a little bit, and inflation and unemployment didn't really move much. So what's different now? What's different now is that you see a very different picture of the risks that the labor market. You've seen, we were looking at 150,000 jobs a month at the time of the last meeting, and now we see the revisions and we see the new numbers. And I don't want to put too much emphasis on payroll
Не
jobs,
трябваше да се
but
мести
it's
лимита.
just one of the things that suggests that the labor market is really cooling off. And that tells you that it's time to take that into account in our, in our policy.
Идеи за златото бих влезнал на лонг, може би от weekly open, може би ще сложа някакви
by the
лимити.
end of next year and the Fed not getting back to the 2% target until 2028. So I guess I'm just wondering how you characterize the risk to price pressures of kicking off a series of cuts at this point.
Yeah, so I would look at it this way. We fully understand and appreciate that we need to remain fully committed to restoring 2% inflation on a sustained basis, and we will do that. At the same time, we've got to weigh the risks to the two goals. And I would say since April, to me, the risks of higher and more persistent inflation have probably become a little less. And that's partly because the labor market has softened, GDP growth has slowed,
Да, този
so
лоу
I would
на
just say that
S&P
the
обран,
risks there have been less than one might think.
този на
And in terms
NASDAQ
of the
не
labor
е.
market, what we're seeing is unemployment is still low, it's still a relatively low rate, but we're seeing downside risks.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg Radio and Television. I'm a little confused by your explanation of the Fed cutting rates because of unemployment. If you think that most of what's happening in the employment area is related to immigration, which your rate cuts wouldn't address, how do you see that as more important than
Добре, имам
inflation,
повече
which remain
S&P, ама
almost a full percentage point above your
не се
target?
искаше малко
I
по-надолу да
was saying
дропне.
that what's happening in the labor market has more to do with immigration than it has to do with tariffs. That was the question I was answering. So I wouldn't say that all of what's happening in the labor market is due to tariffs. I mean, you clearly have a slowing in due to
Малко ще почнем пак да ме
immigration,
филва лимит ордери на NASDAQ.
which is now perhaps more than that because the unemployment rate has ticked up. So that's what I meant by that.
We can follow up. Every year since 2015, the S&P has forecast that you would hit your target 2 years later. And this year, this SEP says you're going to hit your target 2 years later. 2% does not seem to be in sight. Does that suggest that the 2% target is not really achievable? And does this present any credibility problems for you in telling people that that's what you're going to do if you can never reach it?
Well, I mean, you're right. It does say we're going to get to 2% inflation in 2028 at the end of 28, but that's literally how you put the projections together. You're writing down a rate path, which is designed to create over the course of the SEP, time frame, 2%.
Аз не съм го шортнал, но съм заложил
Order failed.
That's all that is.
заложил съм лимити много надолу и лека по лека сега трябва да почна да вкарвам.
3 years. The nature of the exercise is to write down policy that you believe would return to the 2% goal over at least by the end of the exercise.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth Schulze with ABC News. The latest inflation report showed that prices are still going up across key categories for many households, including groceries. What will the Fed do if prices pick up more?
So our expectation, and you can see this consistently through the year, has been that inflation will move up this year, but that the effect, basically because of the effects on goods prices from tariffs, but that those will turn out to be a one-time price increase as opposed to creating an inflation. That's been a forecast. Pretty much all the individual forecasts say that. We can't just assume that though, right? We have to, our job is literally to make sure that that is what happens, and we will do that job. Right now, the situation we're in is
Order failed.
We see
Затворихте още профит на NASDAQ.
expected to move up, maybe not as high as we would have expected it to move up a few months ago. The pass through of the tariffs.
За сега $1100 профит на NASDAQ.
The labor market has softened, so the case for being persistent inflation outbreak is less. And so that's why we think it's time for us really to acknowledge that the risks to the other mandate have grown and that we should move in the direction of neutral. So what will we do? We'll do what we need to do, but we have two
На
mandates and we
златото
try to
си
balance them.
мисля,
For a long time, our framework says that when our two goals are in tension, this is quite an
мисля да сложа,
How do we decide what
може
to do? Because
би,
our tools can't do two things
на
at once.
4-5, да, ще сложа на 4-5 лимит ордер на златото, на личният акаунт с доста
Order filled.
малка позиция.
Our policy had been really skewed toward inflation for a long time. Really.
Добре, NASDAQ ми затвори още профит, 1177 вече.
So we're moving in the direction of
Concerned are you about the slowdown in the jobs market for households at home, especially younger Americans struggling to land a job?
So it's an interesting labor market, and obviously we think it's appropriate that we reduce rates so that we become more neutral, which presumably will be better for the labor
Бодрон,
market.
дай да ти 300 лева и ти показвам личния си акаунт за последните 3 месеца. Окей ли си? Put your money where your mouth is. Така че прати 300 кинта ей тук в чата. 300 кинта и показвам личния акаунт пред всички.
If you start to see layoffs,
има ли сделка?
The people who are laid off there won't be a lot of hiring going on, so that can very quickly flow into higher unemployment. In a healthier economy, healthier labor market, there would be jobs for those people. But now the hiring rate is very, very low. So that's been a growing concern over the last few months, and it's one of the reasons why we think it's appropriate that we begin to shift our policy focus toward
the opposite of recalibration. Are we meeting to meeting, data point by data point? Are we in the process here of getting back to neutral? Thank you.
So I think we're in a meeting situation. We're going to be looking at the data. Let me say a word about the SEP really here. So we often point this out. What the SEP is, it's an accumulation of the individual projections of 19 people, showing what they believe at a particular moment in time to be the most likely path for the economy and thus the appropriate path for monetary policy as well. And as you know, we don't debate or try to agree on it. We just write them down, accumulate them. We do sometimes discuss them. And so we always say we're not on a preset path, and we really.
И типичен фейк акаунт между другото си ти също.
Decisions we make are going to be based on the incoming data, balance of risks at the time the decisions are actually made. So.
Добре, злато, очаквам да тапне тук.
10 participants out of 19 who wrote down 2 cuts for the end of the year, and 9 who wrote down fewer than, in fact, in a good number of cases, no cuts. So rather than looking at this as certainty, I would encourage people, as always, to look at the SEP as through the lens of probability. And so there are different possible outcomes and likelihoods rather than this one is certain and this one isn't happening. So that's what I would say.
Thank you for getting to my follow-up question. It's the dispersion in the outlook, uncertainty of policy in the meetings to come. Thank you.
It is such an unusual situation. Ordinarily, when the labor market is weak, inflation is low. And when the labor market is really strong, that's when you gotta be careful about inflation. So we have a situation where we have two-sided risk, and that means there's no risk-free path. And so it's quite a difficult situation for policymakers. And it's not at all surprising to me that you have a range of views. It's not so much about having different views for the path of the economy, it's partly that, but it's also partly about what's the right thing to do in light of this. The tension between the two goals. How do you weight them? How worried are you about one versus the other? And it's natural. I think it would actually be surprising if you didn't have a pretty wide range of views based on, in this kind of highly unusual situation, and we do. So, we get together, we discuss, we have a great discussion, and then we decide what to do and we act. But you're right there that it's a wide dispersion of views, and I think that's understandable and natural in the current situation.
Order filled.
NASDAQ дропва ли?
Hi, Victoria Guida with Politico. You've talked a lot about Fed independence and the importance of
Order filled.
years, but As markets have questions about what
Добре,
exactly
Nasdaq
President Trump's intentions are
дропва
with the Fed,
и ми
what
филна
would you
два
point to
лимита,
as the
така
things they
че
should be
слагаме
watching
тук
to determine that the Fed is still making decisions
take
based on,
profit.
the economic considerations?
Look, it's deeply in our culture to do our work based on the incoming data and never considering. That's just regulators at the Fed really feel strongly about that way. So, you'll know it by the way we talk about what we're doing, by the speeches that people give, by the decisions that we make. You'll know that we're just still going to do that. That's all we do. And we don't frame these questions at all, or see them in terms of political outcomes. I think when you get to another part of Washington, everything is seen through the lens of does it help or hurt this political party, this politician. That's the framework. And I think people find it hard to believe that is not at all the way we think about things at the Fed. We're taking a long
Злато съм му сложил лимит ордер, но само секундата още не го е тапнал това, което... Някъде тук около Weekly Open нещо такова, мисля, но само с 0,05 нещо такова, в смисъл много късичко на личен акаунт.
And people they're making their arguments, and we're having a really great discussion around these challenging issues. So,
Do you see the court case around Lisa Cook as being related to questions of Fed independence?
I see it as a court case that would be inappropriate for me to conduct.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Edward Lawrence from Fox Business. So we saw the preliminary benchmark revisions down 911,000. The revisions for June were the first negative revisions we've seen since December of 2020. How can the Fed base important decisions on rate and what to do with with interest rates on data that seems to be, as you called it in the past, noisy?
So on the QCEW, the revision that we saw was almost exactly what we expected. It was made about the expectations. So in the
order filled.
Добре, Nasdaq затворих още профит, още 100.
There's been almost a predictable overcount, and I think the Bureau of Labor Statistics really does understand this, and the open market fix it. It's got to do with. Of course, it has something to do.
Слагам стопа на профит.
It's also got to do with what's called the birth-death model. Because a good amount of job.
Златото, брат, това е тази реакция толкова рано, очаквах по-надълго.
And it's just really hard. You can't survey for that.
Stop filled.
Добре, затворим и на профит тук е
especially when the economy is in big changes. And we're working on that and making progress on it. But the data we get is still well good enough for us to do our work.
Много шит. Защо?
Issues around data right now. It's about low response rates. That's happened all
fuck, ние сме ударили Weekly Open обаче на Futures. Аз чаках да ударим Weekly Open на London.
Less volatility. And the way to get that is to make sure that the agencies that collect the data have sufficient resources to drive higher response rates. It's not a complicated problem. That's what it takes. It's not a mystery. That's what it takes. The other thing I'll say is in the case of the job creation, the response rate is quite low for the first month, or lower for the first month. By the time you get to the second or third month, you're still collecting responses for that last month, for that prior month, and you get to the place where they're much more by the second, certainly the third month. So it's not that we don't get the data; it's just that we get it a little later.
But for benchmarks, if that was 51% of the jobs that we thought weren't really there, shows a weaker job market coming into this year. If you had that information, you'd have changed your mind related to where the interest rates should be. Should there have been a cut earlier?
We have to live life looking through the windshield rather than the rearview mirror, as you know. And all I can tell you is we see where we are now, and we take appropriate action. And we took that appropriate action today.
Thanks, Howard Schneider with Reuters. So, as you mentioned a minute ago, some margins in the job market would suggest.
Вижте как пишат по един и същи начин. Фейк акаунтите. Абсолютно едно към едно. Аз ви казах, преди години в Impact канала бяха направени поне 120-130 фейк профилчета, така че всички профили след 2021-2022 са яко фейк, направени специално за Impact канал.
right? And it's has already been baking in expectations. I mean, our market works through expectations, right? So I think our policy path really does matter. And I think it's
Деян, това не знае как се отдърли пак. Май малко рано отворих.
You see minority employment, you see younger people who are more vulnerable economically, more susceptible to economic cycles. That's one of the reasons, in addition to just overall lower payroll job creation, that shows you that the labor market is weakening. I would also point to labor force participation.
Доста се разигра, за съжаление, нагоре и не ми филна ордера. Ударихме Weekly Open, обаче на фьючерс, не на Оланда и това ме преба.
So we use our tools, and it starts with a 25 basis point rate cut, but the market's also pricing in a rate path. I'm not blessing what the market's doing at all. I'm just saying it's not just one action.
The growth mix right now seems very concentrated in investment and on the consumer spending side.
Виж как пише гурата, мурата, същия език, абсолютно същия език. Сега ще го бавна и ще се появи нов. Сега само гледайте. Бавам го и ще се появи нов.
We're getting unusually large amounts of economic activity, AI build out and corporate investment. I don't know how long that will go on.
Днес още или утре ще се появи нов с абсолютно същите изречения. Гората, мурата, не знам си какво.
Nonetheless, it's spending. So, I mean, I think the economy is it's moving along. Economic growth is going to be 1.5% or better this year.
Тъй като не ми се рискува
Forecasts have been coming up, as you can see.
личния акаунт тук, може да тествам с някаква малка позиция на златото, лонг и от пропа. Но то трябва да дропва добре.
Hi, Stephanie Rule, MSNBC. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said that the Federal Reserve suffers from mission creep and institutional bloat.
Влиза сел обаче на златото, ще изчакам малко.
Would you support an independent review or are you open to any sort of reform in any of this?
I, of course, am not going to comment on anything the Secretary says or really any other officer says. So in terms of reform at the Fed, we just went through a lengthy and I think very successful process of updating our monetary policy framework.
Ние сме тапнали обаче перфектно в фьючерса на Азия, едночасовия кендъл, Midnight Ranger.
And at the board, are they the right size? We're actually going through a 10% headcount.
Някъде от тези нива очаквам да има.
Order filled.
Ще вляза на златото.
Basically at the same level it was more than 10 years ago. So we will have had zero job growth for more than a decade when we're finished with that. And I think we'll probably do more than that. So I think we're certainly open to constructive criticism and ways to do our jobs better.
But not an independent review?
To
Mr. Chairman, Neil Irwin with Axios. There's been some debate lately on whether AI is already starting to affect the labor market in terms of lower labor demand, higher productivity by contrast. Do you buy that? And if that is true, does that have implications for the monetary policy setting?
So there's great uncertainty around that.
То тук вече почна да влиза някакъв бай през златото. И аз влязох на пропа, след малко даже се отворя паршъл най-вероятно. Даже слагам стоп лос вече на профит.
And yeah, there may be something there. It may be that companies or other institutions that have been hiring people right out of college able to use AI that more than they had in the past. That may be part of the story. It's also part of the story, though, that
Order filled. Order filled.
Затвори ми единия парша на профит. Майко, какъв лонг на златото става в момента. Леле. Леле.
Stop filled.
Добре, затворих вече два парша на профит.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. What evidence do you see of tariffs from inflation?
If you can take goods just to sort of.
Това ти беше изцяло от Азия мидрейндж.
Last year, goods inflation.
Щеше да е хубаво да наличния акаунт, макар и.
That was the typical thing. Was that goods inflation? Goods prices went down, even adjusting for quality. So that was not the case during the pandemic, of course. Goods inflation essentially returned to zero or slightly negative inflation. Now, I think goods inflation over the course of the past year is 1.2%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a big change.
Да, показа делтата трапнат селър долу, доста голям.
0.3 or 0.4.
И имаше добра реакция. Ето го по футпринт.
So it's contributing.
Ето тук имаме трапнат цел, булиш делта и ето ви резултата.
Mostly being paid by really the companies that's between the exporter and the consumer. So if you buy something and you sell it through retail or you use it to make a product, you're probably taking a lot of those costs on and not able to pass it fully along to the consumer. That appears to be what we're seeing. All of those companies and entities in the middle, they'll tell you that they have every intention of passing that through in time, but they're not doing that now. To the consumer, the pass-through is pretty small. It's been slower and later, than we thought. But the evidence is it's very clear.
755
I also wanted to ask.
755 плюс 1177.
I have nothing new
Почти 2К.
on that for you today.
Hi, Katerina Saraiva.
Но наличния изпуснах.
I just wanted to follow up on.
Наличния изпуснах е бати шорта на GBP-то и ще откача.
We've often heard you talk about how you and your colleagues, you do not think about politics. This does not enter the room. But one of your new colleagues does come from this world, right, where everything is seen through this framework of politics and of what party is being helped, and that person is still employed by the White House. How can markets and the public interpret some of his speeches, for example, and then some of, the forecast that we see today? I mean, the median for this year was moved because of the introduction of his forecast. I'm talking about the number of rate cuts seen this year. What do you say to markets and the public that are trying to interpret?
Wow, NASDAQ is that long.
So there's 12 of the 19 participants of 12 vote, as you know, on a rotating basis. So no one voter, can really.
Да, у NASDAQ съм затворил вече всичко.
Move things around is to be incredibly persuasive, and the only way to do that in the context in which we is to make really strong arguments based on the data and one's understanding of the economy. That's really all that matters. And that's how it's going to work. And I think that is the institution. That's in the DNA of the institution. That's not going to change.
So, приятно е да направих пария все пак. И златото много гадно го изпуснах на личния акаунт също.
Why do you think that is, and what's your response? What's your message to the public?
Our response is we're going to do everything we can to use our tools to achieve the goals that Congress has given us.
Ами все още влизат някакви байери.
So I think that's what we're going to do. Just going to keep doing our jobs.
Аз бих прибрал поне някакъв паршъл.
Pleasure in financial forums. And given the range of views expressed prior to the meeting, I think there was a lot less dissent today than a lot of people expected.
Но за колко малко не ми
just what you think the drivers were of coming to that very strong
Ударите
consensus in the
просто
meeting, and
надкара
also on
лимит,
the flip side to
вкара
just explain
лимит ордерите.
why the plots are really sort of scattered between, some people expecting rates to end up higher by the end of the year to 5 cuts. I mean, what were the kind of range of views you had about, on one side, why there was so much support for a cut today, and on the flip side, why there's so much divergence about what...
46, аз бях на 44, после го преместих на 43, защото мислех, че ще дропне още малко, но не видях, че сме ударили weekly open на futures. За съжаление. А пък на GBP не влязох на шорта. Бях сложил лимит ордер тук. Преместих го по-нагоре, защото мислих, че ще стигнем до месечният rejection блок. Ето тук. Но реално пак сме хитнали всъщност месечния rejection блок.
And so that meant different things for different people. Some wrote down, almost everyone that wrote down.
Money is the root of all evil. Добре, отиди тогава в някой беден квартал. Между другото, вижте кога е регистриран този Иван също. 23-та година. Казвам ви, всички акаунти, регистрирани след 22-та, пишат едно и също нещо. Гурута, мурута, паричи се там, нямаш душа, нямаш да го наспо. Всички тези фейк акаунти са правени след 22-та година. Не, Форекс трябва само личен акаунт.
Nature of the challenges that we face. But let's remember though, the unemployment rate is 4.3%. The economy is growing at 1.5%. So it's not a bad economy or anything like that. We've seen much more challenging economic times. Standpoint of what we're trying to accomplish. What to do. There, as I mentioned earlier, there are no risk-free paths now. It's not incredibly obvious what to do. So we have to keep our eye on inflation. At the same time, we cannot ignore.
Да, можеш да трейдваш Apex. Също можеш да трейдваш Forex с Apex. Но трябва да отвориш фьючерсите, но не ме кефи графика там, честно казвам. Добре, аз си затварям всичките buy лимити за NASDAQ, тъй като NASDAQ вече доста скочи и не мисля, че ще върне пак там, където ми бяха лимит ордерите.
Thank you, Archie Hall from The Economist. You mentioned earlier that job creation is running below guess, so that's break-even rate. Curious to hear a bit more about that, what you think the break-even rate is.
So there are many different ways to calculate it, and none of them is perfect. But it's clearly come way down. You could say it's 50,000. And you'd be right or wrong. There's just many ways, different ways to do it.
Мисля, че златото може да продължи много нагоре.
Wherever it was, 150,000 a few months ago, it's come down quite significantly. And that's because
възможно е, но аз вече бих затворил парчето. Бих сложил стоп-лос на entry.
The supply of labor was coming from over the last 2 or 3 years. So we're not getting that. We've got much lower demand. It's interesting that supply and demand have really come together. Except now we do have unemployment ticking up outside, just one tick outside.
Stop field.
Range where it's been for a year. 4.3% is still a low level. But I think this level of this speedy decline in both supply and demand has certainly gotten everyone's attention.
Well, if I may, you mentioned the downside risk to employment, but it's striking that measures of kind of activity now.
Не знам. Може би съм забрал някакъв ордер за сел.
It's very strong. You mentioned strong PC as well. How do you square those things? Is there a chance actually could be upside risk to the labor market if activity measures are
implemented? That would be great. We'd love that to happen.
Не виждам никакъв лост, така че.
You see a big tension there, but it's gratifying to see that economic activity it's good. So it's it's a good bit from consumption. It looks like consumption was stronger than expected. What we got earlier.
Златото, профит, да, бях сложил 100% на профит и ме стопнал.
Sector is producing a lot of economic activity, which is the AI build out and business investment. So, we watch all of it, and I would say we did move up.
Добре, махам си.
This year actually moved up in the S&P between June and September.
Махам си buy лимита за сега на златото. Искам да видя дали ще оберем този лоу и дали ще реагираме от
Didn't change much. It's really the risks that we're seeing in the labor market that were the focus of today's decision.
Mid-range на Азията. Че сега влизат доста цел на злато.
Thank you for taking my question. Given the cumulative impact of high interest rates on the housing sector, I'm wondering how concerned you are that current rate levels are exacerbating housing affordability issues and potentially hindering household formation and wealth accumulation for a segment of the population?
Housing is
Има белише S&P между другото на NASDAQ и S&P и за сега го отработва.
When the pandemic hit and we cut rates to zero, the housing companies were incredibly grateful.
Ще лонгваш ли златото? Не знам, тъй като за сега този белиш кендъл е с доста белиш делта. Сега ще ви покажа. 2800 волюм, 325 белиш делта. Ще видим тук на това ниво ще има ли някаква реакция. Дали ще имаме трапните селари. Това ниво трябва да го гледаме.
And so some of that should happen. I think most analysts think that it would have to be pretty big changes for it to matter a lot for that. Big changes in rates for to matter a lot for that. And the other thing is by achieving maximum employment and price stability, that's a strong economy. That's a good economy for housing. And then the last thing I'll say is, if there's a deeper problem, there's not a cyclical problem that the Fed can address.
Видяхте ли как трапнахме селари и цена тръгна нагоре?
Housing shortage. Or a lot of places in the country just don't have enough housing for people. And the areas like Washington, for example, are very built up, and so you're having to build farther and farther out, and so that's where it is.
And just a quick follow-up. During the last SEP,
Но си мисля, че златото ще обере този едночасов лоу също.
Policymakers lacked conviction about their projections, and I'm wondering if you still feel that way.
Forecasting is very difficult even in placid times. And as I've mentioned before, forecasters are humble a lot with much to be humble about. So I think right now is a particularly challenging time.
Искам да дропнем в това ниво принцип, тъй като това вече го отработи.
Forecaster anywhere. Ask any of the forecasters whether they have great confidence in their forecast right now. I think they'll honestly say no.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance. If you're cutting rates, why continue to reduce the size of your balance sheet, then pause the unwinding?
Well, I think we're cutting the size of our balance sheet quite marginally now. As you know, with the balance sheet, we're still in an abundant reserves condition in which we've said that we would stop somewhat above an ample reserves level. That's what we are, and we're getting closer to that. We're monitoring it very.
Видяхте ли как баннах Волтрон и веднага се появи следващия трол? Сега банвам Иван, гледайте какво става.
Pretty small numbers moving around inside a giant economy. The level of runoff is not very large, so I wouldn't attribute consequences to that at this point.
And at his recent confirmation,
Малко ще се появи нов трол, регистриран пак след 2022 година.
Three mandates from Congress, not just jobs and stable prices, but also moderate long-term interest rates. So what does Congress mean by moderate long-term interest rates? How should we understand that when we see the 10-year Treasury
футпринта, там където трапнахме селарите, пак се надърви зверски.
like rate cuts or balance sheet reductions affect the long end of the yield curve?
So we always think of it as the dual mandate, maximum employment and price.
Тази зона доста я респектираме.
Because we
God
think
damn it.
moderate long-term interest rates
А не
are
се иска
something
да-
that will result from stable
Искаме се да
inflation,
оберем този лов.
stable inflation and maximum. So we don't have.
И да видя тогава какво ще се случи с
for a very long time as
футпринта.
a third mandate that requires independent action. So that's where that is. And there's no as far as I'm concerned, there's no thought of considering that, considering that we somehow incorporate that in as something in a different way.
Thanks, Chair Powell. Matt Egan from CNN. We recently learned that average FICO credit scores are down this year by 2 points, the most since 2009 during the Great Recession, and delinquencies are high for car loans, personal loans, credit cards. How concerned, if at all, are you about the health of consumer finances, and do you expect today's cut will help?
So, we're aware of that. I think default rates have been kind of ticking up, and we do watch them. They're not at a level. I don't believe they're at a level where overall they're terribly concerning, but it is something that we watch. Lower rates should support economic activity. I don't know that low rate cut is an effect over time. A strong economy with a strong labor market is what we're aiming for, and stable prices. So that should.
This rate cut is coming at a time when the stock market is at or near all-time highs, and some valuation metrics are elevated historically. Is there a risk that cutting rates could overheat financial markets, potentially fueling a bubble?
We're tightly focused on our goals, right? And our goals are maximum employment and price stability. And so we take the actions that we take with an eye on those goals. Separately, and that's why we did what we did today. Separately, we monitor financial stability very, very carefully. And, I would say it's a mixed picture, but households are in good shape. Banks are in good shape. Overall, households are still in good shape in the aggregate. And I know that people at the lower end of the income spectrum are under pressure, obviously. But from a financial stability perspective, we monitor that picture. We don't have a view that there's a right or wrong level of asset prices for any particular financial asset, but we monitor the whole picture, really looking for structural vulnerabilities. And I would say those are not elevated right now.
То не са хора, това е един същ човек.
Hi, Chair Jean Young, Minai Market News. I wanted to ask about inflation expectations. You've said that Fed can't take the stability of inflation expectations for granted.
Всички акаунти са нови.
Short run, they've gone up a little bit. I wonder if you can talk a bit about that. And then also at the long run, I'm wondering, do you see evidence that the debate over Fed independence and the growing deficit is putting pressure on inflation expectations?
So as you said, shorter term inflation expectations have tended to respond to near term inflation. So if inflation goes up, inflation expectations will predict that it takes just a little while to get back down. Fortunately, throughout this period, longer term inflation expectations both break even in the markets, and almost all of the longer term surveys, Michigan being a bit of an outlier lately, have been just relaxed in terms of running at levels that are consistent with 2% inflation over time. So we don't take that for granted. We actually assume that our actions have a real effect on that, and that we need to continually show and also discuss our commitment to 2% inflation. And so you'll hear us doing that. As I mentioned, it's a difficult situation because we have risks that are both affecting the labor market and inflation. Those are our two goals, and so we have to balance those two. When they're both at risk, we have to balance them, and that's where we're trying to get. I don't attribute the latter part of your question was about independence. I don't see market participants. I don't see that that's something they're factoring in right now in terms of setting interest rates. Thanks very much.
Today's conference, with Chairman Powell down in Washington, D.C., here in New York City, we're reacting to a 25 basis point rate cut from the Federal Reserve, a descent pushing for 50 basis points, and a huge debate about the future. Anna Wong of Bloomberg Economics with this to say.
Добре, то приключи. И златото, мамка му, защо не гледа фьючер да вляза на личния акаунт от тази зона? Напрегнах се. Най-вероятно ще продължим нагоре. С златката. Не, добата и ритуала са реални, другите не са. Насдак е изхвърчал отново, да. Но на Насдак също съм затворил всичко. Като цяло, мисля, че можех да извлека доста повече от тези новини. 2К профит е файн, но можеше и да е доста по-файн. Момчета, май ще го приключвам лайфа, защото мисля, че няма да видим кой знае какви движения вече. За златото, тъй като реагирахме от силна зона, предполагам, че ще стигнем горе-долу това ниво тук. Но генерално тук изпуснах лонга, тъй като очаквах да тапнем weekly open и да тапнем weekly open плюс Азия едночасовият midrange, но не обърнах внимание, че гледам Ланда и реално е направил точно това, което искам, обаче на фьючерс. Фьючерс по принцип е една идея по-точната графика и трябваше да гледам фьючерс, но си го отчитам като грешка. Доста тъжно. Доста тъжно за мен. Добре, ами приключвам лайфа, тъй като не мисля, че ще хвана вече някакво смислено движение. Сега по-скоро бих трейдвал out of FOMO и ще направя някаква глупост. Ами влизам бай за сега на клъстър делтата, така че има вероятност. Зависи къде ти е ентрито, сега ако е много нагоре ентрито, ще е тъжно за тебе. Но генерално смятам, че ще отидем нагоре. Добре, приключвам лайфа и ще се видим утре в 4 часа отново. 3683 8.3, това предполагаме на спот. 8.3 8.3, тук горе си влеза на лонг. What the fuck? Защо брат? Тук какво има? Why? Брада, не успех, брат. Доста неприятно ентри имаш. Избързал си я. Добре. Чао, лека вечер и